Yeah, I'm at that page. So once it starts, I can mute it. Okay. Yes. Yes. So I'll mute it. Hmm. Okay. Okay. Mm. And I'll be basically collecting all the questions and then asking directly via Zoom, right? Hmm. Okay. Okay. Hmm. Okay. No, I think I'm good. So is once Rod is back, we can just quickly test it.
I'm back.
Okay.
I'm back.
Rod, can you share your screens once more? I just want to test something from my side.
Sure.
Okay. Okay, that works. Thanks. You can take it down.
Uh, yeah. Let me check one thing. I'll check one thing and I'll reshare in a sec. Okay. And can you remind me what so it looked like the slot was for an hour and a half, but somewhere I read that I should target something like 60 minutes. Is that correct?
Uh, I think you can take an hour. So I'll briefly introduce it to you at the beginning, and then suppose if you speak for an hour, then we have like half an hour left for Q&A. That should be sufficient.
Okay. Okay.
Okay. Um, can you stop it? Um, Welcome back, everyone. My name is Shomodatta, and I'll be chairing this keynote session of EnvirVis. So let me introduce our speaker. It is my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Rodman Ray Lin. Dr. Lin is a senior scientist at Los Alamos National Laboratory and the associate director for fire science with the wildfire lab at University of California, San Diego. Dr. Lin is an adjunct professor for undergraduate engineering at the University of New Mexico. He received his PhD from New Mexico State University in mechanical engineering in 1997. Dr. Lin is an expert in wildfire and atmosphere modeling and has been leading projects involving the development, implementation, testing, and application of computational models for wildfire behavior. He has also led the development of Lannel's wind blade model for studying the multi-scale interaction between wind turbines and surrounding complex wind patterns. Today, he is going to talk about the opportunities and challenges that arise as scientists study and develop the fire atmosphere models and how visualization helps in understanding the data generated from these models. With this, let us welcome Dr. Lin.
Can you hear me? I assume. Okay. So I appreciate the opportunity to discuss some of the things that we've been doing related to coupled fire atmosphere modeling. A lot of it's been done at Los Alamos, but a lot of it is also, but it's been done in partnership with people at the U.S. Forest Service and Tall Timbers and various institutions in France and Portugal and Canada as well, and Australia. So what I'm presenting is certainly a collection of work that has a lot of different contributors. I'm just the presenter of the day. So with that said, I'd like to first of all make a mention of where this is in its evolution. So until about 25 years ago, the only wildfire models were empirically based, basically curve fits to some laboratory experiments with a few observations in the field. But starting about 20 years ago, the computational power started to get sufficient to try to write physics-based or process-based codes that would simulate the physical processes of wildfires, which of course includes the fluid dynamics of the atmosphere that surrounds those fires. So you see in the upper left is a picture from one of the first couple fire atmosphere models. This was a 2D slice. You can see the smoothness of this fire as it gets close to a simple hill that it was about to move up. One of the things that's come along, though, that's been a huge help in increasing the value of these models since the late 90s has been the growth in visualization capabilities that have accompanied the growth in computing power. Through the computing power advances and the visualization advances, we've been able to increase the sophistication of the models and our understanding of wildfires significantly. So these models can be used for science discovery, risk assessment, and management, and we're moving towards a place where we can use these more sophisticated models to support land management, and I'll talk to you a little bit about that at the end. So I think with this said, in order to keep things going, I'll go ahead and move on, but hopefully we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. So wildfires obviously have been a challenge to society for a long time, and there's been people interested in them and trying to predict what they will do and how to manage them for a long time. So why are they still a challenge? So first of all, they're a significant challenge because there's a wide range of critical length scales. Everything from flame sheets, which are sub-millimeter, to atmospheric scales, which are tens to hundreds of kilometers. And those are all important for the movement of a fire. So with today's computers, we still can't simulate the full range of time and length scales to capture a fire's evolution. The other challenge is that wildfires are the result of a combination of a wide range of coupled phenomena. Complex chemistry, people don't realize it, but the combustion of wood is actually a huge, complicated chain of chemical reactions, starting with the pyrolysis or thermal breakdown of the wood material out to the gas phase combustion. And that by itself is really complicated. Then you add on atmospheric dynamics. We know how hard it is for forecasters to get our weather right. Now take that down to the scales of fires, and it's even more challenging. Then you disturb the atmosphere with the fire, and it's a big mess. So it's really complicated. You've got the influences of dynamic and heterogeneous conditions. What does that mean? Well, if you think about even your most homogeneous forest, that's still heterogeneous from the standpoint of the fire. You've got a tree here and a tree there and spaces between those trees. And so that makes a really complicated environment. Then you've got winds that are dynamic, even in a relatively steady wind environment. You have the interaction between the atmosphere and the vegetation, which at the fire scales is still going to be turbulent. And the other key here is that we can develop these models, but it's very hard to do detailed observations for refinement or validation of these tools. It's very hard to measure all of the conditions that affect a fire as it goes forward. So wildfires are made up of a variety of smaller building block processes. These are things like convective heat transfer, radiative heat transfer, the combustion process itself, aerodynamic drag through the vegetation. And theoretically, we can understand these different processes, a lot of them pretty well. And for things like aerospace engineering and other fields, we bank on the fact that we can predict how those individual processes are going to react and what their sensitivity is to their environment. The challenge with wildfires shows up because we're linking all of these different processes together in a very nonlinear way. Many of them are quite sensitive to other ones. So wildfire behavior becomes a balance between many different processes. And these processes are affected by the vegetation or the fuels, the winds, the moisture of the vegetation, and topography. And so doing process-based or physics-based modeling as opposed to empirical modeling means that we're trying really hard to represent the dominant processes and the interaction between these processes to get something that results in what we call wildland fire behavior. One of the things that has shown up through this research is that it's nearly impossible to simulate the physical processes that control a wildfire, and thus the wildfire itself, without simulating the atmosphere around the fire. There's a two-way coupling there that is really critical for the fire behavior. So how do we do this? Well, we write a series of partial differential equations, and I would not encourage anybody to try to read these in detail while I talk. But the point is that we write conservation equations for mass, momentum, and energy, and turbulence, and we couple them all together in a consistent fashion such that they're interwoven, and one partial differential equation is affecting the other one. The idea here is that the terms in these equations are linked to specific processes in this interwoven, combined thing that we're calling wildland fire behavior. So it's impossible to resolve all of these scales, as I mentioned before. So the way we attempt to do that, the way we attempt to solve those partial differential equations I showed on the previous slide, is to break the fire environment up into a series of small volumes, call them cells. And in this case, we're thinking of cells being on the order of a meter or a couple of meters. This allows us to look at landscape scale fires, but still capture the effect of, say, spaces between trees or under trees, which are actually really important. There are some that are claiming that fire behavior is more about where there is not fuel as opposed to where there is fuel, which is an interesting frame of reference. So by breaking the fire environment up into a three-dimensional matrix of cells, it allows us to track the movement of air between the cells and look at the changes in the environment in each cell individually. This allows us to explicitly resolve the advection of quantities, that's the movement of say, heat, for instance, or oxygen as it's carried by the air, the effects of topography, the influences of macro-scale fluid structure. And what I mean by macro-scale, these are things like in this picture, which would be the motion of air around a tree, or the motion under a tree, or around over topography. It also allows us to explicitly capture the influences of heat released by the fire and its effect on the winds. However, if you start thinking about the fact that I mentioned that fire goes all the way down to sub-millimeter in important processes and link scales, there are things that are going on that are subgrid or sub-process, or I mean subgrid or sub-data processes. These subgrid phenomena or conditions might be fine-scale temperature distributions within a cell, fine-scale mixing in chemistry, fine-scale turbulence, or the momentum and heat exchange between the fuels or solids and the gases. So, for instance, pine needles are a drag on the winds, but we certainly can't resolve those at meter scale with meter scale grids. And we have to parameterize that, the effect of that drag. Additionally, the energy exchange with those pine needles must be parameterized. So if we keep in mind that there's some parts of the wildfire behavior processes are being explicitly resolved and others are not. Then when we look back to our partial differential equations, the circles here indicate specific terms And for instance, a single color generally represents that where that term shows up numerous times. Unfortunately, some of the colors have gotten squashed into one color here, looks like. Anyway, these are all where the subgrid terms show up. And this is where there's a lot of current research being done in wind tunnels and research labs across the world to try to understand what's happening with these subgrid models. So, especially for the context of this presentation, I'd really like to point out the critical importance of visualizations in the analysis of the results that we're producing with these models. The visualization provides multi-scale context for the evolution of local scales. The behavior of fires is very heterogeneous, even in the simplest of scenarios, and I'll show you some of that. And so looking at a single point, and just watching the temperature at a single location, really doesn't provide us very much information unless we can put it in context. And the visualization helps us immensely put this into context. So the other piece of this is there's a lot of interplay between different processes at the same location. And so being able to visualize how those multi-scale effects of different processes are affecting a single point is critical. And so for the rest of the presentation, there's going to be a variety of different graphical representations, which I won't claim to be a visualization expert. But we have had to work hard to think about how do we investigate various processes using visualization, and how do we use the visualization to convey what we're learning. So let's step back to wildfire behavior. So the simplest fire that we can think of is a constant wind blowing a fire on homogeneous grasses. And in the past, this scenario would have been modeled as having a single spread rate, right? Homogeneous grass, constant wind, flat slope. With an empirical model, that means you get a single spread rate for both of these fires. On the upper left, you see a picture of a fire of three fires that were lit at the same time on grass, and you can see that they have very different spread rates. The only difference between those fires is the length of the ignition line. So this is the same paradigm as is on the simulations. So the key then is to see if we can back up and understand why does the ignition line length, which I would translate to size of the fire or shape, why does it affect the spread rate? And so the computer simulations allow us to tear the fire apart and think about it closely. Now, what we visualized here is two different fires, one ignited from a 400-meter long fire line and one from a 100-meter long fire line. And they're ignited at the same time but have very different behaviors and spread rates. The red to blue coloring is indicating pressure perturbation, and the white is indicating 2D flow lines, and it's a little bit challenging because it's a 3D simulation. And so if you try to do streamlines and or even stream tracers in 3D flow, you know that sometimes that's a challenge to make it really tell you what you want to understand. So I'll throw that as a visualization challenge. How do we capture this? So, but the key here is that the flow coming in from the left with streamlines, when the lines are close together, the flow is moving fairly fast. And when the lines diverge from each other, the flow is slowing down in general. And so the picture on the left illustrates as the flow comes in behind a fire, some of those winds are diverted to the flanks of the fire, the sides of the fire that are running parallel to the wind. And then some of it reaches the head of the fire and is able to push through the fire line and push it forward. And we can see that there's a little bit of divergence or a little bit of space that opens up between those streamlines as it reaches the head of the fire due to the competition of the flanking edges to the head. If we go to the right, the picture on the right, the streamlines diverge much more significantly as they approach that head fire. The flanks are competing with that head fire for wind. Thus, the tighter fire line, the tighter curvature, shorter fire line, results in less fast-moving wind getting to the head of the fire. How do we visualize this, and how do we convey that message so people understand it better is a challenge. So one of the challenges that's been presented for the fire community over the years has been this notion of a wall of flame. People like to think of it this way because it simplifies our idea of what fire does. In this visualization, we see a fire that's coming at us. We see a plane that's lined up with a white line. And the vectors here, the colors are indicating flow perpendicular to the plane, where the blue is actually being sucked back towards the fire as it approaches us. And the greens and up to reds are the winds coming at us. So what you see here, first of all, is fire is a very heterogeneous environment. And as it comes forward and as it's just about to cross that line, you see this tower and trough process. And what's important to think about here is now if I had a single sensor in a field or in a numerical simulation, and I placed it along just at one location, what I would measure at that single location is not very representative of what's actually driving the fire, because I might, for instance, be in a tower or an updraft, or I might be in one of those downdrafts that you'll see here in a second, where hot gases are actually being pushed down towards the fuel in front of the fire. Therefore, the visualization and the ability to dig in and study these different structures that show up as the fire comes along is really, really important to think about context for what a measurement might show. So here's an example of a simulation of a fire that happened in 1996 in Southern California, where fire spotted to the bottom of a canyon and then spread up the bowl on the left. And I'll show you the topography a little bit better in a second. And the challenge here was that the empirical operational tools gave a 1 hour, 2 hour, 3 hour propagation for the fire to reach the place where it was burning houses. Unfortunately, the reality was it took 20 to 25 minutes, and there were some poor decisions that were being made due to the poor representation by the model. We used physics-based model, in this case FireTech, to represent the spread of the fire up that bowl to the left, using fuels captured from a hyperspectral sensor. And when we first did this, we actually got the fire was going too fast. So we went back, and the National Park Service had a different database describing the vegetation, which had the blue line up the middle. Now, the simulation on the left and the simulation on the right were actually started at the same time. But you see the riparian zone in the bottom of the canyon on the right, which is thicker fuel, more fuel, but it's got a lot more aerodynamic drag. And the fact that that aerodynamic drag exists in the bottom of that canyon changes the flow field significantly and changes the way the fire moves. So what this tells us is something that's somewhat counterintuitive, because the simulation with more fuel actually burned slower and didn't just erupt up that canyon. So the simulation on the left here, that's shown on the left, did not have the riparian zone, did not have that extra fuel in the bottom of the canyon, and it got to the place where the houses were burned and the firefighters were hurt in 12 to 18 minutes. When we added fuel, again, counterintuitive, when we added fuel at the bottom of the canyon, which was true, it was really there, we got 18 to 24 minutes for it to reach that point. The documented time was 20 to 25 minutes. So we can learn a lot through these kinds of simulations and visualizations about what's happening and why is it occurring. So fuels for wildland fire are a big challenge. It's not a homogeneous map of combustible material. It's got structure, it's 3D, it's got spaces that are as important as the presence of fuel. So we have to think about the influences of vegetation structure on the aerodynamic drag, on the convective and radiative heat transfer, on the moisture exchange, and on the reaction rate. And how do we do this? Well, in each one of these computational cells, we imagine, is there a tree in that particular cell? Is there surface fuels down on the ground? And if there is, then we can populate that with bulk density, or the amount of fuel that's there, the moisture, and the shape of the foliage that's there. If that particular cell happens to be in between trees, for instance, then it doesn't have any fuel. And capturing that heterogeneity is really important. There's been a fair amount of work done to look at winds over heterogeneous vegetation. And again, it's challenging to take this three-dimensional process, which generates winds that react to a fuel break, and take that 3D structures and put it into 2D for presentation or for putting it in a paper. That's a challenging thing to convey what's going on. So here we have a forest that's been visualized with isosurfaces of bulk density of the canopy, and we're using color to indicate whether it's being convectively cooled or convectively heated. And people don't think about convectively cooling as an important part of wildland fire behavior. But if you have a fire that burns in underneath the forest and it does not burn all of the canopy, that's largely due to convective cooling. Convective cooling here being the blue shading is where the cool air is being drawn in by the fire, and that cool air, the ambient wind, is able to keep the temperature below combustion or even scorch levels on the canopy materials. So that indraft is as important as the hot updraft, and it's that balance between the two that is really important. Another key thing to realize is that the variability in the wind is also really important. Here we have, I'm going to show you a simulation where we have some winds that are blowing in streamwise direction. The mean wind is 6 meters per second in both of the simulations, but we've superimposed on it some lateral fluctuations. So this is back and forth, and those are simple lateral fluctuations characterized by a sinusoidal wave. And so what you see here is, depending on what those oscillations look like and how strong they are, you actually get different fire behavior. And so here on the right, we have stronger back and forth fluctuations, stronger, I mean, you can equate this to turbulence. It's not truly turbulent because I just used a sinusoidal wave. But by letting the flow meander back and forth to the left and right, I actually get faster downwind spread, even though in both simulations the downwind mean wind speed is the same. So being able to look at this and understand why, and then in future operational tools account for the effect of that turbulence and those fluctuations is really important. So one of the things that's important when we work with these models is always putting them in context. There's observationalists, which do a fantastic job of trying to make observations, and they don't know what to make of models, and modelers see observations as less interesting. But I think our perspective is that it's critical to have them woven together. So here's a context to put in your mind, and that is that the observations are full physics. They are reality, but they're only partially disclosed. What that means is that when we go out in the field and we're observing a wildfire, or we set an experimental fire, it's really hard to measure everything. It's really difficult to measure the three-dimensional flow fields. It's really difficult to even measure the fuels adequately. So it's full physics, but it's only partially disclosed. Whereas a model is only partial physics, because we aren't getting down to the flame sheet level if we're still doing landscape scale. So it's only partial physics, but it's fully disclosed. With today's computing power and data storage and visualization techniques, we can tear apart the simulation and look at all the interactions between all of the different processes. And so observations and modeling should be thought of together. Process-based modeling helps us test our understanding, helps us develop new hypotheses, which can be then tested with observations. So one of the things as we go forward that is critical is understanding how fires are going to act in new environments. And this new environment could be the result of climate change, changes in vegetation, could be the effect of long-term drought, fire exclusion. In many parts of the world, fires have been being put out for nearly a century, and as a result, our landscapes are changing. But there's also abrupt events like insect mortality. On the right, you can see a forest that's been heavily ravaged by insects, bark beetles in this case, pathogens. In the southern part of the U.S., we've had some immense blowdown events as a result of hurricanes, and those blowdown events changed the structure of the forest and put an enormous amount of dead biomass on the ground. leaving a changed fire environment. So the U.S. Forest Service has used these kind of models to try to look at the interaction between bark beetle mortality and winds, bark beetle mortality and fires under different wind speeds. So I'm going to show you some matrices of different fire behaviors that have occurred, and there's three different levels of mortality, and then three different wind speeds, and there's something called the gray stage and the red stage. The red stage is after the trees might have been killed, but the needles are still on the trees. This was what was shown in the picture on the left here. Is the needles are still on the trees, but the trees are dead. And then the gray stage is after the needles have all fallen off the trees. So one of the important things is to think about how do these disturbances interact, and how can we characterize the interaction? And so Carolyn Seeger, the Forest Service, developed a synergism matrix, or synergism value that indicates how much the insect mortality changed the fire behavior. And one of the interesting things that's come out of this research is the fact that at low wind speed and so let me back up. On this slide, we have across going from left to right, we have low, medium, and high wind speeds, and going from top to bottom, we have 20% mortality of the ponderosa pine, 58% mortality of the ponderosa pine, and 100% mortality of the ponderosa pine at the bottom. And so the interesting thing that's happening here is many people would have expected this to be most extreme at high winds, but the synergism is actually most extreme at low winds. And the way to interpret that is that in this case, by disturbing the forest and killing some of the trees in the red stage, has the strongest effect when the fire behavior would have been marginal, when it would have had a hard time creating a crown fire. In a case where the winds are strong and a crown fire is going to exist on its own, the beetle kill doesn't change things all that much. However, at the red stage, or at the gray stage, this is after the pine needles have fallen to the ground, the synergism has a very different effect. At high winds, having the insect mortality event before the fire actually makes the remaining trees more resilient. And so it actually has a negative synergism at high winds. So as I've mentioned, the advancements in computing and the advancements in both data collection and visualization have allowed us to use these models, these high-performance computing-based models, to study wildland fire behavior, but they're not the solution for all problems. Operational fire decisions they don't benefit directly from these HPC simulations because they're too slow still. They're still running on the order of 60 times slower than real time on hundreds to thousands of processors. And so we need to think about other kinds of tools for operational purposes. We have to think about computational costs. What are the model assumptions and formulations? How much detail do we really care about? And if we're talking about operational decisions, how much, are we dealing with specific structures that we're worried about? Are we dealing with specific topography that could be of high interest? If in fire management, one of the things that's done periodically is to light a fire in front of another fire, so you have a backing fire that then is able to consume fuel in front of a head fire. Here you see a backing fire, which was the one that was in the simulation first, then a head fire, and at some point, the head fire and the backing fire will start to interact and pull each other together. This is a really important phenomenon for both fire management as well as prescribed fire practices. And so being able to use computational models and visualization to be able to understand when do those fires interact and when do they not interact is really important, but also the ability to convey this for training purposes and help people understand where the thresholds exist is important. So prescribed fire is growing in importance as we realize that we have to get proactive with our forests, and we realize that fire behavior, trying to deal with large fires after they've been started is not working all that well. So there's a lot of places in the U.S. especially, and other parts of the world for that matter, that are where prescribed fire is something that's being used to manage the landscape. But there's lots of questions as we train new people to do this practice of, if we're going to light prescribed fire, it's all about the ignition patterns, and it's all about the interaction between fires. So what's the importance of how much ignition, what's the ignition density? If you put down more fires, sometimes you actually get better fire results. In other words, more control, because you're controlling one fire with another fire. The other thing is we need to know where the smoke is. So in this simulation, we've got two different ignition patterns or ignition techniques. One is line fire ignition with ATVs, where they're lighting 5 simultaneous lines in a staggered pattern. And the other one is aerial ignition, where a helicopter is flying sort of a Z pattern and dropping incendiary ping pong balls. This is done quite frequently for prescribed fire in the U.S. But the challenge with prescribed fire is now you're not only responsible for keeping the fire where it's supposed to be, but you're also responsible for where the smoke is going. And so your ignition patterns and your ignition rates and your ignition densities change how high the smoke goes. It changes how much smoke is put out. And so being able to simulate that and visualize that is really important for making good decisions and educating new practitioners. One thing that's very different for prescribed fire than wildfires is the interaction between the canopy and the ambient wind. So in a wildfire, such as the one on the left that you've already seen, the wind is pushing the fire downwind. So the fire is actually consuming vegetation and reducing the drag behind the fire, allowing the fire to move more quickly. Whereas in prescribed fire, based on the way the ignition patterns are performed, the ignition patterns are done in such a way that practitioners are lighting fire as they progress in an upwind direction. And so this is something that we ran across accidentally when we were trying to visualize these fires. We were looking at these winds and realizing that because a practitioner is moving upwind, there's a fundamental difference between prescribed fire and wildfire. In prescribed fires, the vegetation is still intact upwind, and thus it's sheltering the winds and keeping the winds low for the fires in a prescribed fire, as opposed to the wildfire where the winds have been drawn away. Using these kinds of simulations to study the low frequency but very high consequence events is very important. These are things that we can't run large-scale experiments on, so we have to use simulations to do it. Then the challenge is, how do we visualize it? How do we tear apart this complex interaction? Here we have a downwash event on the left. That this might be a thunderstorm outflow or a plume event that where high density, this is just temperature, air that's a couple degrees cooler, for instance, comes down and creates a density current that rolls across the landscape. On the upper right, you see that density current. The gray is an isosurface of air density that intersects a fire. And you can see by the picture on the upper right that there's a backspinning motion that is associated with this density current that slides in underneath the warmer air. On the lower right, we're trying to use the velocity vectors to look at how does that density current interact with the fire behavior. And what we see here is you can see that backspinning motion that's driving the heat from the fire down towards the surface and causing the heat to be more effectively transferred to the unburned fuel in front of the fire. Without this kind of visualizations, that realization is nearly impossible. So again, it's really, really important that we continue to improve our ability to visualize this. So one of the most effective spread mechanisms in many fire environments, severe fire environments, is spotting. And spotting is the process by which firebrands or burning material are lofted from a fire and carried up to kilometers downwind. And so they negate the use of fuel breaks, for instance, because new burning materials sewn right over fuel breaks, it can trap firefighters, etc. But one of the key things as we try to do a better job of predicting where this spotting will occur is understanding the lofting process. And so on the picture on the right, the large one on topography, what you see is that the topographic features themselves change the lofting pattern. On the fire on the left, you get this channeling where all of those firebrands are being funneled to a single plume, and you're actually getting a lot of loft. Where down in that canyon, in the middle, you're getting more diffuse lofting of particles, as well as on the right. If we look at the simulation on the left, which is just a grass fire, and we can see what's happening to these particles, they're not being lofted as a sheet. And so the average upward velocity is not the important parameter to look at. It's the velocities in those towers and troughs that we talked about earlier. It's important here. You see those filaments of burning material that are being lofted. We need to be able to assess what is the velocity, the upward velocity in those filaments. Here we're using simulations to study what the effects of doing some thinning in the bottom of a canyon might be. You can see in the lower picture, there's less fuel in the bottom of the canyon. But one of the important things that we realized in these simulations was, and this was through the visualizations we realized it, was that the firebrand activity or spotting activity was probably the biggest threat to the facilities that we were looking at, or the housing that we were looking at downwind. So in these simulations, the blue dots are firebrands that have been lofted, and the white dots are firebrands that have reached the ground. And so after the fire goes by, we can look back at the white patterns and realize that the topographic shape of that canyon is creating concentrated areas of firebrand deposition, and thus high likelihood for new starts of fires. So what have we learned about predicting fire behavior? Well, one of the things I mentioned early on is that we've learned about the really critical nature of the interaction between the fire and atmosphere. And on the right, we've got prescribed fire, where you're just looking at the corner of a burn unit where there's a unit to the right that's already been in the simulations that has already been burned. So there's no surface fuels. But just looking at those velocity vectors and understanding how much they control the interplay between those fire ignition lines is really important. And the other thing that we've learned is the importance of fuel structure. The presence of that burn block downwind that doesn't have the same amount of fuel, you can tell by the brown on the ground instead of the green shading, is that more air can actually be drawn back through that unit to feed the fire. And so the presence of fuel around a burn block is as important as the fuel inside the burn block. So using these things that we've learned, can we develop new tools that can run at real-time speeds to support decision makers? And so we've been developing with the U.S. Forest Service and with Tall Timbers Research Station a new tool to specifically be run on laptops to support prescribed fire decision makers. And to do this, we've tried to take the things that we've learned from the high fidelity fire tech simulations that we've been talking about and applied those to a quick running wind solver that was developed at Los Alamos that has been used for urban dispersion problems. But what we've tried really hard to do here was reach back. We know that the coupling between the fire and the atmosphere is really important, and we can't forget about it because it's the determining factor, and the fuel structure. So we've tried really hard to preserve that in a fast running tool. So we've created a model called QuickFire, and this is a QuickFire simulation where the fires, on the pictures on the left, the wind is coming from the lower left and moving upward across the main and spreading fire. And again, the challenge is how do we do the proper visualization to understand if we're getting these processes right. Here we've tried to use a color isosurface to capture the intense burning in orange, and then the velocity vectors superimposed on that becomes challenging because in three-dimensional fuels, those isosurfaces show up over the top of the vectors, and you can't see them very well. On the right, we've tried to, again, increase our understanding of what the model is predicting by showing these vectors from a different perspective, and the vectors are, here we've got a plane of vectors, although the calculation is a three-dimensional calculation. We're trying to leverage what we've learned from fire tech simulations to make sure that QuickFire is capturing the critical phenomenology, even though we're having to do much simpler physics. And so, but again, visualization is a key here to being able to understand the differences. We've tried to back up and make sure that we're getting, with fast running tools, we still get the critical response of fire to changes in the environment. Here we've got what looks like it's purple, but it's actually a 1 meter checkerboard of fuel and no fuel. So red and blue starts to look like purple. So you can think of the purple area as having gaps between the fuel in a checkerboard pattern. And at low wind speed, that's enough to stop the fire's progression in this simple tool. But it's the absence of vegetation in every other square reduces the aerodynamic drag and reduces the buoyancy effects, which actually accelerates fire spread at higher wind speeds. And so this is an important thing that's observed in nature, and so it was critical that we capture these with these fast-running tools, even though the physics is reduced. We can test whether or not we have the right response to brakes and fuel. Here we have a different size fuel brakes, and as you would expect, the fire is responding by stopping as you progress the size of the fuel brake. Again, these are initial basic phenomenological testing for QuickFire. This is a brand new fast running tool. This is for the 4 meter wide road that stops the fire at 2 meters per second. As you increase the wind speed, you're able to get over those roads and continue to burn. Moisture response. This is all just testing, and again, the visualization is really important here. How does the fire respond to changing winds? How does the fire respond when you create ring fires, which is a really critical thing for prescribed fire? And this is highlighted in the couple fire atmosphere interaction. And probably most important, or equally important, when we combine all these different contributions, heterogeneous fuels and topography for these fast running tools, do we get the right fire behavior? Does it spread with the right patterns? Are we getting the right amount of consumption on the landscape as well? So I think I've got a few slides just to bring back the questions or the points that I think are important from a visualization standpoint. The visualization here is a really, really important tool for being able to understand what these complicated physics-based and even the fast-running tools are producing. The environment is highly heterogeneous, it's highly dynamic, and just looking at, say, a virtual sensor in these simulations does not do justice to the phenomena that we're trying to understand. So, not being a visualization expert, but having to play with it and toy with it for years, this is a great opportunity for people in the visualization world to contribute. Being able to think about how do we visualize what's going on in this multi-phase environment. Here was the case where we had the green trees are represented with an isosurface of fuel density. Well, what I'd love to be able to see deeper and see underneath them simultaneously as being where here the view is obscured by the presence of the green canopy. How do we do that better? How do we better visualize the multi-scale and multifaceted, I should say, events that are progressing? How do we keep the context of the large scale and the small scale both available in our analysis? I think it's too easy to focus on one and not the other one, and the visualization, being able to look at it from multiple vantage points is a critical piece of the puzzle. And I think this is the last slide I'm going to use. And it's just we were looking at fire that was approaching this canyon, and it seemed to stop and then start on the other side. And so we had to dig in deep and look at the hot gases and look at the burning fuel from different angles to understand what happens. And on the upper right, you can see what happened was we actually got sufficient heating and spotting across this canyon to start a new fire on the right and allow it to go on. So I think that's where I'm gonna end this and open it up for questions, although I'm not sure how the questions are come across. So I'll hand it over. So I think hopefully in this talk you understand that there's a lot of progress being made in how do we model and predict wildland fire behavior. There's still really complex problems, still a big challenge. Data needs are very significant. We need to understand the atmosphere. We need to understand the fuels. But the computational advances are making a big difference, and the visualization is a key element.
Okay, thank you, Rod, for the nice talk. This is very interesting. I think it's sort of new to me. I've never really seen this kind of work. So this is very interesting. I see there's a large portion of your work relying on visualization, which is very encouraging. So I do have a few questions from our audience. So the first question is from Gary Scheuerman. And the question is, how do you get the model data for your simulations, like trees or vegetation?
So that's actually a whole research effort on its own. In some cases, it's been by people going out in the forest and measuring trees. And if it's for a specific site, in some cases they've gone out and they've measured all the trees and they've done it by hand. In some cases, they're using LiDAR to measure trees and get fuel distributions in a 3D matrix. In most of our simulations, what we've done is we've created virtual forests based on measured trees. So maybe they've measured a 1 hectare or 100 meter by 100 meter plot of trees and the surface vegetation, and then they create a distribution of trees and a stem density, we'll call it. And then from that, we can extrapolate that to the larger landscape, anywhere where there's that kind of vegetation, to create virtual forests. But there's a huge emerging field that's based on how do we combine satellites and airborne LiDAR and terrestrial LiDAR techniques, along with some field sampling, to create these three-dimensional maps for these forests. Because historically, the fuel classification for models was just a 2D map.
So the second question is from Kirsten, and he's asking that if you create a model for a given region of interest with perfect data, apparently it's still difficult to keep making adequate predictions. Results seem to be depending on so many factors that estimates might change drastically with seasonal changes, weather, plant growth, etc. How can you even create adequate estimates for stakeholders if results can change fundamentally over a few weeks or with small changes in weather conditions?
So it's a fantastic question, and that's one of the reasons why we've been trying to create these reduced order models like quickfire, and one of the reasons why we've been trying to combine the physics-based modeling with machine learning, because we feel like the best way to handle the challenge that the question is highlighting is through ensembles and distributions. And so by being able to run ensembles that map over the conditions, we can at least get, here's the most probable fire behavior, but here's some outliers that could be really devastating, or here's some outliers that would act in a way that would surprise people. So I think it's it's like predicting the weather 3 weeks from now. That's really challenging, but we're getting better at understanding the likely scenarios that are going to come along. And it's like hurricane prediction. We run an ensemble of hurricane models to come up with the envelope of possible trajectories for a hurricane. So I think it's a very similar concept and direction.
Okay, thanks. So another question from Garrick is, how do you evaluate your really involved simulations? Obviously, there is a lot of uncertainty in the model, like what is modeled and how precise are the equations, and in the parameters, ambient wind, vegetation, fuel. I guess this is sort of similar to the previous question. And along that line, I would also like to ask, like, do you collect observation data? If you do, then how do you collect it?
So I go out on a number of experimental campaigns, but I don't lead them. But there are there are a number of experimental campaigns that are focused on how do we gain observations to validate model predictions. So that's one. But the other part of that is we've learned through some of those true wildfire observations as well as experimental campaigns that we need to think about. The influences of things like turbulence, which cause that variation in behavior, and we need to account for the fact that we don't know the details of the wind fields. And so it comes back to having the distribution of fire behavior and having here's the mean and here's the distribution of what the fire behavior looks like, and then doing statistics on are we getting are the actual fires within the envelope of predicted fire behaviors.
Okay. Um, so here is another question from Kirsten. So in the sorry, from Gerrit Sherman. So he's asking that in the beginning of your talk, you mentioned a cooperation with Australia among others. As most of us know, there were devastating fires last year in Australia. Have you looked at these cases? Any comment on these cases, like special conditions, challenges for modeling, etc.?
So I have not looked at the. I mean, I've looked at them from a from some distance, shall we say? But I've looked at them without getting into the details or trying to simulate them. We're working with Jason Sharples to collaborate, and certainly Jason has spent a lot of time looking at the details of those Australian fires. And so, but I personally haven't done simulations of the Australian fires.
Thanks. So the next question is from Roxana here at Lanel. So how is the aerial prescribed fire started in practice?
I'm not sure if I completely understand the question, but it sounded like the question was how do they ignite those aerial fires? Is that the question?
Probably, I think so. Yeah. Like, how do you do those in practice?
So literally, what they're doing is they have a dispenser, so a bin of ping pong balls that have an accelerant in them, and they have a machine that will kick these ping pong balls out with an accelerant in them at a given rate, and they can speed that up or slow it down as they fly, so they can also fly faster or slower to put more space between the ignitions. And so they basically inject these ping pong balls with a chemical reaction that has a delay time of like 14 seconds or something, and they drop them out of a helicopter, and 14 seconds later they start a little fire, and then those fires grow in size until they're interacting. It's actually a practice that's used quite commonly in the southeast, and they're starting to use it a lot more in the west when they do prescribed fire. In the west, prescribed fire environments are a little bit more challenging because the fuel's in a different stage and the topography is severe. So being able to do it from a helicopter is valuable if you're trying to do a large landscape.
So I have another question. So you mentioned a little bit about using machine learning techniques, and since its popularity recently, so can you talk a little bit more about like how much are you relying on machine learning techniques, and like how do you see in the future? Do you see that you are going to rely more on this to model it more accurately or predict the behaviors?
So I think machine learning is so. I to be fair, we've only been starting it in the past year to use machine learning, so I wouldn't want to oversell how mature that is, but it's a huge opportunity for collaboration if there's those that are heavy into machine learning and would like to partner. It's a great opportunity. But so machine learning can be used in a variety of different ways. It can be used in the refinement of these simplified tools. The minute you go to reduced order or simplified tools, you start throwing out physics, and so there's more model parameters. And so being able to combine machine learning to adjust those parameters, and it might even be dynamically adjust those parameters, is really important. But it's also, we can use machine learning to go back and dissect and attribute changes in fire behavior, for instance, in California or Australia, and try to understand what conditions really have changed, say in the past 30 years, that that are changing those fire environments. There's lots of anecdotal, well, I think it's because of the weather, or I think it's because of the fuel, but it's not that simple. And so we can use machine learning to go back and look at the thousands of fires that have happened in California in the last decade, and look at the trends on what those are. How much of it's weather, and how much of it is fuels conditions, and how much of it is ignition sources, and so machine learning has the opportunity to help us really dial in on critical factors also.
Okay, thanks. So one last quick question. I was wondering, so like the type of vegetation, like have you seen affecting the spread of fire? Like if you have a pine forest versus if you have, say, different kind of trees, say aspen forest. So I guess they also contribute to the spread.
So aspen trees actually frequently are seen as a fire barrier. They don't. When the leaves are on the trees, on aspen trees, which they usually are during fire season, they're actually very high moisture, and so aspen trees they block the wind and they have a pretty high moisture. So it has to be a really strong fire to burn aspen trees. So so it's the vegetation structure, height to the crown from the ground, and the moisture level in the foliage that's really important. What people don't realize is that even a crown fire, what we look at on a devastated landscape as a crown fire, usually the crown fire is reliant on the surface fire. If you remove the surface fuels, say through prescribed fire, you really diminish the forest capability of sustaining a wildfire. And probably there's another opportunity to point out the fact that the coupling between the fire and atmosphere is really important. Because if you have a surface if you don't have a surface fire, a tree that's on fire is drafting cool air up from below, and that sends the flames vertically as opposed to into the next tree. And it makes it very hard for fire to spread if you're not pushing heat from below the fire, from below the crown.
Interesting. Okay. And if I may ask one more question, so in case suppose you have a city which is very close to a forest region, so like do you model something specifically for that kind of situation where people living very close to the forest, and then there is a possibility of a forest fire? Like how do you react to that, or do you consider those in your modeling?
So we have done some of that. We've done some simulations of those kinds of scenarios, and we're starting to work with people that do evacuation modeling to understand how those decisions can be made in a better way. One of the challenges for most wildland-urban interface type fires, like the ones we've seen in California in recent years, is that the fire spread is heavily influenced by the spotting, by the transport of burning material through the air. And so one of the things that we can do with modeling is to start to understand where the likelihood of spotting is, because that's how you get people trapped, is by starting fires in the interior of a wildland urban interface. You might be therefore closing off evacuation routes or trapping people between two fires then. And I think that's the most dangerous scenario. So I think that's where for wildland urban interface and community protection, thinking about the spotting behavior is where we need to go as a research community.
Okay. So thanks a lot for answering all the questions, and I thank everyone who have asked questions and all the audience. So I guess we are at the end of our keynote talk for this year's EnvirVis, and I also thank you, Rod, again for giving this great talk. And with that, I'd like to conclude the session.
Well, hopefully it was interesting, and thank you very much.
Thank you.